على آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم لا سهل إلا ما جعلته سهلا وأنت تجعل الحزن إذا شئت سهلا سهلا. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. اللهم أخرجنا من ظلمات الوهم إلى نور الفهم وأكرمنا بمعرفة العلم وزين أخلاقنا بالحلم يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم فك الكرب عنا وعن كل مكروب من أمة محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم أنت به عليم. يا ربنا نسألك في هذه الأيام الفاضلة المباركة أن تفك الكرب عن إخواننا في غزة وفلسطين. اللهم انصرهم نصرا عزيزا مؤزرا. اللهم انصرهم على القوم الظالمين. اللهم انصرهم على القوم الظالمين. اللهم أطعمهم من جوع وآمنهم من خوف. اللهم يسر أمرهم. اللهم فك الكرب عنهم وعن إخواننا في السودان وفي اليمن وفي سوريا وفي كشمير وفي سائر البلاد والبقاع. أنت بهم عليم يا رب العالمين. ولي أمورنا خيارنا ولا تولي أمورنا شرارنا ولا تسلط علينا بذنوبنا من لا يخافك ولا يرحمنا. اللهم اختم لنا بخير أجمعين. الحقنا بالصالحين واجعلنا من ورثة جناتك جنات النعيم يا أرحم الراحمين. آمين آمين. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين. أما بعد, جزاكم الله خير for attending today. Today is the fourth session of this mini-series. It's actually the last one. It was supposed to be a 5-part series, but we didn't have class during Memorial Weekend because I expected people would be busy. So in this session, we're going to wrap up. We went over different parts of Islamic civilization as is laid out in this book. And in the first session, the introduction, we went over glimpses from our past. We went over how Islam contributed to many different parts of life, and how Islam as a civilization was more than just worship and Islamic knowledge. So much more to it than that. And we went over some of the humane sides in Islamic civilization. In the class after that, we went over racial equality. We went over religious tolerance. And in the last class we met, we went over the rights of the environment and animal rights. And in today's session, we're gonna, speak a little bit about etiquettes in war. That's what I titled the session. And if as time permits, it's not going to be a long class. We're going to maybe perhaps speak a little bit about the later chapters, which are charitable institutions and the system of waqf. And maybe a little bit about hospitals and medical institutions. There's a lot to say about what Islam contributed to the world. This was supposed to give you a glimpse. And of course, it's an easy read. This book's an easy read. As we said in the very beginning, it was initially a series of radio talks broadcasted in the middle of the last century from Syria by this Shaykh. His name is Dr. Mustafa Sibai. So you're talking about content that's from probably 75 years ago or 70 years ago, something of the sort. So the world's come a long way from then, but still the contents of it remain extremely relevant, and they teach us a lot about what's unique about Islam. So hopefully you could read the rest of the book on your own, whatever we didn't get to ourselves. We're not going to be continuing with this after Eid. It was meant to be a mini course so that it finishes with Eid, this one and the one that we meet on Tuesdays for, which is the Prophet's emotional intelligence. That ended up, it's going to be a 6-part series. The last session is this coming Tuesday. And then we have the summertime. In the summertime, we're not going to offer anything on Sundays because I think people are usually busy with their families. But we may offer a course on Tuesdays, inshallah. But we'll see. We'll announce that, inshallah. So, and then besides that, there was a few sources I wanted to point you towards that relate to, like if you're someone who likes to learn about history, which is not the majority of people, it's a minority of people, as you could see. If you're one of those people who likes to learn about history and Muslim inventions and Islamic achievements, then I'm going to put some books in the WhatsApp group before we close out the group, just so you get that information and continue to further your readings on it, inshallah. So, looking at our etiquette in war. There's a lot to say about this. Starts off with the example of our beloved Prophet, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who teaches us the highest standard. The Quran sets this standard. Respecting human life is one of the greater objectives of Islamic law. As we mentioned before, the greater objectives of Islamic law include 5, and the first of these is preservation of life. And then we have preservation of faith, preservation of intellect, preservation of wealth, and preservation of honor. So these are the 5 greater objectives of Islamic law. Preservation of life, sanctity of life is really, really big. And that's why, we learn from, and he mentions this in the very opening of the chapter, the beginning of this chapter, chapter 6, he mentions the story of the first murder. The story of the first murder between Qabil and Habil. In summary, we learn from the story that Qabil, who killed his brother Habil, sanna sunnat al-qatl. He's the one who set this. He set this standard among human beings for murder. And so he will continue to get the sin of every murder ever perpetrated after that. It's a very awful thing that humanity has turned to bloodshed, and it's actually one of the signs of the hour, by the way. Great loss of life is referred to in the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ says, وَيَكْثُرُ الْهَرْجِ. In the end of times, bloodshed and loss of life will become senseless. It'll become so widespread, and it'll be to the extent that the one killing doesn't know why he's killing, and the one killed doesn't quite understand why he was killed. It'll be senseless like that. And this is exactly characteristic of our time. Whether you're talking about something that is just a random act of violence, like we have in some of our areas where there's like a drive-by shooting, or just someone who gets into an Uber and decides to kill the Uber driver for $100. There's stories like that, senseless. Or like we see happening on a bigger scale between countries, like we see what's happening in Gaza. Some innocent person who has been displaced and in a tent, doing nothing to harm anybody, just starving to death slowly, and all of a sudden, just because of some pressure that Israel wants to apply on the other side, this person's killed. This person's killed for no good reason at all. It's a'udhu billah. So it's a crazy thing how this happens on large scale during our times, and it's exactly what the Prophet ﷺ said will happen. There'll be no sanctity to life. There will be no sanctity to life. And when we look in the Quran, we find that the directive is for war or for peace. That's for peace. Of course it's for peace. One of the crazy things that Islamophobes tried to sell to the world, and Orientalists, mustashriqeen, tried to sell to the world, was that Muhammad ﷺ is a warmonger. It's funny, it's funny from how nonsensical and contradictory this presentation is. The West, which has spread more wars than the entirety of human history combined in the span of 100 years, characterizes Muhammad ﷺ as a warmonger? What world do you live in? Do you know the numbers of the death tolls that were in the wars of the Prophet ﷺ's lifetime? The Prophet ﷺ's message spread most in peace, not in war. Spread most in peace. When did most people become Muslim? When the Muslims were in Mecca, or when the Muslims were in Medina? When there was peace and it was a Muslim society, it spread exponentially more. and in fact, the peacetime allows for people to process things and understand things and ask questions. That's what the Prophet ﷺ was seeking. Prophet ﷺ, and that's why the Quran tells the Prophet, he mentions this verse here, وَإِن جَنَحُوا لِلسَّلْمِ فَاجْنَحْ لَهَا وَتَوَكَّلْ عَلَى اللَّهِ. But if they incline to peace, you incline to it too, and put your trust in Allah. Now, this does not mean that war does not exist, because obviously we know that there is Surah At-Tawbah in the Quran, Bara'ah, and that's a wartime surah. The language of the surah is what Islamophobes use to speak about the Prophet ﷺ and claim that Islam teaches to kill people of other faiths. But no, I as a Muslim need to be confident in the response. Here, what is spoken about, or the context of the surah, is a declaration of war by committing an act of betrayal and treachery, massacring the Prophet ﷺ's allies, killing dozens of people. Even though the treaty, you guys know the name of the treaty that preceded all the Surah At-Tawbah. What is it? Hudaybiyah, right? Even though the terms of that treaty were not at all favorable to the Prophet ﷺ. They're not at all favorable to Islam. You know, and I don't want to spend the whole time talking about that right now, but, you know, there was a big disadvantage to the point where the companions were upset. Why did the Prophet ﷺ agree to the terms of Hudaybiyah? But he did, because it was in the best interest of the da'wah. You know, the Prophet ﷺ's, the majority of his message was spent warless, by the way. The majority of the message. They break up the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ into 4 categories. The first category is secrecy of da'wah with no physical confrontation. Then the second phase of the da'wah, and this is when the message went public. This was the highlight of this was when the Hamza and Umar became Muslim. This was in the 6th year after revelation. So they went public before that. The first 3 years were the private years completely. But now, when did they fully go public? When Hamza and Umar radiallahu anhuma became Muslim, 6th year. And after that, so the second stage of the da'wah was what? Public da'wah with no physical confrontation. That was the second stage. And that lasted from the Islam of Hamza and Umar all the way until the hijrah of the Prophet ﷺ, after 13 years of message. Then, the third stage starts in the beginning of the Medinan period and continues until the 6th year after Hijrah. 6th year after Hijrah, which is when the Sulh al-Hudaybiyah happened. And this was the period of public da'wah with physical confrontation in defense. Now, all of the battles that were fought in the early years of Medina were all defensive. Like what? Battle of Badr. Was it defensive or offensive? It wasn't meant to be a battle, but it was defensive. How was it defensive? Because the Prophet ﷺ knew that in his first days in Medina, there was instability to their presence there. And had the kuffar of Quraysh sensed weakness, they would have attacked Medina much sooner. But he kept them on their heels by raiding their caravans so that they won't think about attacking Medina. So, you know, they say, it wasn't offense for the sake of offense. It was the best offense, or the best defense is a good offense. It was in that spirit. It was to defend Medina. It wasn't to go outside of Medina. Right? So you see, that's why Badr happened, that's why Uhud happened, and that's why the Battle of the Trenches happened. This was the third stage of the da'wah. Again, public da'wah with physical confrontation in defense. And the last stage of the da'wah was in the last few years of the Prophet ﷺ's life. And that was when there was now offensive wars and offense. And again, the purpose of these wars and offense was to remove any hurdles or obstacles in the way of the message spreading. An example of one of these wars was a war without any fighting. And it's actually mentioned in Surah At-Tawbah. What's the war without any fighting? Guys, what's the war without any fighting? Tabuk. Yes, Tabuk was the war without any fighting. And that happened towards the very end of the Prophet ﷺ's life. Now, another war in this offensive period, like we're talking about the offensive period of the Prophet ﷺ's da'wah where there was physical confrontation. Another one with hardly any fighting was what? What is it? It's actually mentioned in the surah that tells us about Sulh al-Hudaybiyah in the Quran. It's called Surah Al-Fath, speaking to us about the Fath of Mecca, the conquest of Mecca. Now that's why we learn when we study the seerah in detail that the roadmap to the beginning of the conquest of Mecca was this Treaty of Hudaybiyah. So anyway, that was another battle without any fighting. All right, so where's the offensive battles that led to the loss of so many lives? There's one example of a battle where there was ferocious fighting towards the end of the life of the Prophet ﷺ, and the Muslims were greatly outnumbered. And that is Mu'tah, the Battle of Mu'tah. It's an example. But you see, when you look at the Prophet ﷺ's battles, even when in defense or in offense, it was never about causing human suffering. It was never about causing human suffering. This is exactly, and you know what? This tradition continued with the companions. When you look at the era of great expansion, which was during the time of Sayyidina Umar and the beginning time of Sayyidina Uthman, it was not about inflicting human suffering. Now, you may say that for the Prophet ﷺ's lifetime, he had the underhand. It wasn't, for the most of his life, he and the companions never had the upper hand, or they hardly had the upper hand. They were subjugated. They were, even though in the Battle of Hunayn, it's another example when the Muslims did have the upper hand. But for most of the da'wah, they did not have large numbers. They did not have a strong military might. But that was definitely not the case when the companions went on to spread Islam into North Africa and Persia during the time of Umar and the time of Uthman. Yet they still exhibited the same mercy that they learned from the Prophet ﷺ. Right? You want to see ruthlessness and mercilessness? Go read about the Crusades. Right? So the same ones who claim that the Prophet ﷺ is a warmonger. You guys know what I mean when I say Orientalists, right? Mustashriqeen. You guys understand? What does the term refer to? What does it refer to? Exactly. As our sister said, these are not people who studied Islam because they were considering it to believe in. These are people who studied Eastern religions, among them Islam, and they became acquainted with them for the sole purpose of waging false misconceptions and creating doubts in the hearts of people. They did not study it with an honest, genuine intent, right? These are not people who were looking to learn about the Prophet ﷺ. They were looking for ways to undermine hadith. They were looking for ways to attack the Quran. So it's funny, and again, these were efforts waged by the Western world, and again, it was a largely Christian world at the time. It's so funny and comical how they would claim that our beloved Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was a warmonger when all of the wars that we've seen attributed to the Western world, whether you're talking about before the modern era or after the modern era, were very brutal and gruesome in nature. You forget about the wars, even look at the revolutions. Right? Where do we learn about brutality from? What is the greatest case for the brutality of revolutions? Where do we learn it from? French Revolution. Go see what they did to the people in the French Revolution, right? But when you compare that to the reality, and again, this is not to, this is to set the record straight. Why am I talking like this? This is not to create a polarizing dynamic between Muslims and Christians. There are many Christians who are impartial, searchers for truth, open-minded individuals, and people that we could work with in a common ground. There's many Christians that are like that. Not everyone is agenda-driven. Not everyone is biased. But this is to set the record straight. Our beloved Prophet ﷺ was far from being a warmonger. Another thing that the world today, again, like even if we put, Christianity aside, the new religion that's adopted by the enlightened powers of the world today is atheism. Don't mistake it. Atheism is a religion. Atheism is a religion, right? And what atheism has done is it made people into statistics. It removed any sense of sanctity towards the creation on this earth, because they're not creationists. They don't believe in creation, right? So I create an atomic bomb that's going to wipe out cities. Big deal, right? I create a drone where people could operate these drones from like a video game-like room. What's the big deal? It's okay, right? So anyway, this is the way that we need to have confidence in our deen when we're speaking about these types of things. Etiquettes in warfare, when we go to look at the Prophet ﷺ and what he taught us in terms of etiquette in warfare, we learn from his example that there are those who, even when you antagonize, when you are in a very tense situation with another party, you cannot near them. Their lives are sacred. They should not be diminished. The Prophet ﷺ said in a hadith, he mentions this in the chapter, do not mutilate, do not kill any young child, or old man, or woman. Do not cut down or burn any palm tree. Do not cut down any fruit-bearing tree. Do not slaughter any sheep, cow, or camel unless it's for food. You'll come across a people who have devoted their lives to worship in their hermitages. Leave them alone and leave that to which they have devoted themselves. The Prophet ﷺ said these words to the companions before the Battle of Badr. Now you see how humane this was. Like before we saw the events in our lifetime, we'd think, okay, because the world's forgot what World War II, World War I, and World War II did, how that happened, and how much senseless lives were lost in that. The world forgot, and now we've been reminded in the past 2-3 decades, through all the wars that we saw that were waged, that lacked any of these morals and ideas, especially in the past year and a half plus. We see what's happening in Gaza. These are long-lost values. Do not mutilate. Do not kill any young child or old man or woman. Do not cut down or burn any palm tree. Anyone who does these things, even if they claim to be part of Islam, they're not Muslim. There's no way that a person who has faith in their heart could truly do any of these cruel things. No way, no way. So you're going to tell me, well, this group did that or that group did that. What represents Islam? The character of our beloved Prophet ﷺ and those who devotedly follow him. You will not find someone who has an ounce of mercy in their heart who could kill an innocent human being. In fact, we mentioned in the last time when we were talking about animal rights, when the Prophet ﷺ was horrified about seeing the site of an ant colony burned. And he said, لا يعذب بالنار إلا رب النار. No one can punish with the fire except the Lord of the fire, Allah Azza wa Jal. So then, how on earth can that same prophet be someone who encourages us to take the lives of others senselessly? That's not the case. When war begins, we must not forget our principles, or be cruel, or corrupt, or oppressive, or spread destruction. That's what Islam taught and lived by throughout the Prophet ﷺ's entire time. Now, one of the things that Islamophobes use when they speak about this subject is the people of Ahl Dhimma, Dhimmatud. And Dhimmatud refers to non-Muslims in an Islamic state. Now, in fact, this is used as one of the arguments against Islam, but in fact, you find it something that highlights the mercy and accommodation that our deen teaches. Ahl Dhimma, what does the Prophet ﷺ tell us about Ahl Dhimma? There are people who have established rights, and they have an honor that cannot be disregarded. The Prophet ﷺ himself said, anyone who takes the rights of a person of dhimma, a non-Muslim living among us, I will be his adversary on the Day of Judgment. That's what the Prophet ﷺ said. I will be his adversary. Now the Prophet ﷺ is telling us, not in this life by the way, he's telling us on the Day of Judgment. When technically, if you die upon disbelief, in our iman, can you go to Jannah? You don't go to Jannah. But the Prophet ﷺ is telling us justice is so critical, a principle that we adhere to, that even on the Day of Judgment, I will be the adversary of someone who dared violate the rights of a person of dhimma. Now the people of dhimma, they had to pay something to the Islamic State. What was that called? They had to pay jizya. Is jizya the non-Muslim tax that Islam established to oppress non-Muslims and treat them as second-class citizens? Well, an Islamophobe would like to make you think so, but that's not the case at all. In fact, when you study this historically, jizya was something that was very symbolic in terms of its amount. Again, it was one gold coin that was to be paid by every resident of the state, a very symbolic small amount, and it was paid in lieu of protection by the state for any non-Muslim resident that was among us, because those who were non-Muslim were not expected to bear arms to defend the Muslim state, right? So they basically had a free pass. You don't ever have to worry about putting your life on the line to protect our borders. You never have to worry about that. But you have to pay this jizya in lieu of that protection. What did Muslims have to pay? What did Muslims have to pay? Zakah. Which one is more? If I tell you that, I don't expect you guys to know how much a gold coin is worth. But if I tell you 2.5% of your wealth versus one gold coin, which one has the potential of being exponentially more? It's obvious. 2.5%. What's the proof? Well, if you have $1 million, what's 2.5% of $1 million? A lot of money, right? What's 2.5% of $10 million? A lot more money. So the zakah, Muslims were required to pay zakah, and they were required to defend their land when called to do that. They had two requirements. They had to do this religiously, and they had to do that out of their duties to their lands, right? And then non-Muslims did not have to do this, right? So that explains to you what jizya is, right? Again, now when we speak more about the Prophet, again, if the Prophet ﷺ had bloodlust, if the Prophet ﷺ, someone who's like lived a lifetime of wars, war after war after war, it creates like a personality. Like, I don't know how to function without a war. Again, now the true warmongers of our time, that's the reality of it, right? Wars fuel global economies today. That's why. So you can't go too long without a good war, right? Because good wars means what? You're going to sell weapons, and you're going to have to spend a lot of money to repair. And for certain people who profit from this, again, wars are very profitable. Not for the average person, but for certain people who are prepared to make those profits. Extremely profitable. You're talking about millions and billions of dollars that people make off of wars. Now, if the Prophet ﷺ had bloodlust, then you would have seen a different reality from the Prophet ﷺ when he gained control over his enemies, right? When he gained in Fath Mecca, and what did he say to the kuffar of Quraysh? مَا تَرَوْنَ أَنِّي فَاعِلٌ بِكُمْ. What do you think I'm going to do to you now? They said, أَخٌ كَرِيم ibn أَخٍ كَرِيم. Right? A noble brother, the son of a noble brother. So the Prophet ﷺ said, go, you are free. اذهبوا فأنتم الطلقاء. That's not a person who had bloodlust. The Prophet ﷺ did not have bloodlust. Now the Prophet, when the Muslims were defeated in Uhud, and he's saying this here, because they had gone against the command of the Prophet ﷺ, and his enemies surrounded him and sought to kill him, and his companions were prepared to defend him to the death. He emerged from the battle wounded. His molar had been broken. His face had been cut, and 2 rings of chainmail had penetrated his cheek. Some of his companions said to him, why do you not pray against them, O Messenger of Allah? So he said, I was not sent as a curse, rather I was sent as a caller and as a mercy. إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ دَاعِيًا وَرَحْمَةً. لَمْ أُبْعَثْ لَعَانًا. I wasn't sent as a one who wishes damnation upon others. O Allah, guide my people, for they do not know. Who's the one who killed the Prophet ﷺ's uncle? What's his name? Wahshi. Do you know that Wahshi became Muslim? Later on, in the life of the Prophet ﷺ, Wahshi came to announce his Islam. What do you think the Prophet ﷺ said to the one who killed his uncle? The hadith shows us, the only thing the Prophet ﷺ said to him was, if you can live far away from us, then do so. Because it pained him. He didn't just kill his uncle. He mutilated his body and opened it up and took out the liver and gave it to Hind so she could chew up the liver of his uncle. A'udhu billah. It doesn't get, well, actually, it does get worse than that, but it's pretty bad, right? It's pretty bad. And, I'm afraid that if we repeat the story too much, it'll give some ideas to those in the IDF. I wouldn't put it past them. The ones who play with the toys of murdered children are definitely capable of mutilating their bodies and eating their insides. A'udhu billah. And then besides that, all of the brutality that's coming out of the prison system in Israel is well documented and known. But anyway, what did the Prophet ﷺ say? He said these words. What did Wahshi live with? He lived with the pain of being the one who mutilated the body of our Prophet ﷺ's uncle. And he said, I will redeem myself. So how did Wahshi redeem himself? He was the one who later killed Musaylima al-Kadhab, the fraud. Musaylima the fraud, the false claimant to prophethood. After the Prophet ﷺ's life, he is the one who did that. But anyway, you see the story gives us example after example. Now he gives us an interesting example in the book over here. He says, there was some of the inhabitants of Lebanon revolted against their governor Ali ibn Abdullah ibn Abbas. So he fought them and gained victory over them. He thought it would be wise to separate them and expel a group of them from their homes and send them to other places. This is the least that a ruler would do nowadays in the most civilized of nations. But the reaction, there was a great imam of the time, his name was Imam al-Awza'i. What did he do? He was a scholar of Syria. He wrote a letter to the governor of Lebanon at the time, denouncing him for this action. And he said to him the following. He said, among those of Ahl al-Dhimma who have been expelled from the mountains of Lebanon are some who did not support those who rebelled, some of whom you killed and some you returned to their villages as you know. How can you punish the masses for the sins of a few, expelling them from their homes and property, when the ruling of Allah is أَلَّا تَزِرُ وَازِرَةٌ وِزْرَ أُخْرَى. Look at this beautiful, beautiful. Look, this is our deen. This is our deen. But when we see the ruthlessness of the genocide that's being done against Gaza, continuing to bomb, And, to limit, they want to limit the resources that are getting in and only open 2 checkpoints all the way in the southern of Gaza to force everyone in the north, go get your food from the south. And then when they get there, you know what they want to do. They want to kick all of Ahl Gaza out to Egypt and to other countries. That's what they want to do. That's their plan. And when you see that ruthlessness, look at what's here. So he wrote to this imam, and to the governor, and he said, no bearer of burdens can bear the burden of another. How could you punish a people for something that someone else did? So which is the best ruling to follow and the most appropriate command to heed? The Prophet ﷺ said, whoever mistreats any non-Muslim who has a treaty with the Muslims or orders him to do more than he's able, I will be his opponent on the day of resurrection. So the governor had no option but to let them return to their villages with honor and dignity. See, the pride that we have in our legacy, brothers and sisters, isn't just limited to the time of the Prophet. It's not just limited to the time of companions either. We're not saying that Islamic history is perfect. Are there examples of wrongful acts that were done in Islamic history? Sure, against Muslims and against non-Muslims. There's a ton of that. You're talking about human behavior, and human behavior isn't always how it should be. However, there are tons of examples in our tradition because our deen calls to it itself. Our deen calls to it. And then he gives another example over here from the time of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. He says, when Umar ibn Abdul Aziz became the Khalifa, some people from Samarkand came to him and told him that Qutaybah, the commander of the Islamic army, had conquered their city and brought Muslims to live there by trickery and in an unlawful manner. So Umar wrote to his governor there, telling him to appoint a judge to investigate what they had told him. And if he had ruled that the Muslims were to leave Samarkand, then they would leave it. So the governor appointed, and he mentions his name, Jami' ibn Hadr al-Baji, as a judge for them to investigate their complaint. And the judge, who was Muslim, ruled that the Muslims should leave Samarkand, and that subsequently the leader of the Muslim army should warn them and inform them that there was no peace treaty in accordance with the Islamic principles of warfare, so that the people of Samarkand would be prepared to fight the Muslims without being caught unaware. So, and then he goes on to mention more and more about this. But you see here, can you imagine that? The Muslims, if they were all about being conquerors, well, no, we got here, we're not leaving. We're going to stay here, and we're going to stay here forever. Look, Islamic civilization isn't the most recent in history that set the model for colonialism, right? In fact, in the most recent history, Muslims were in the position of fighting against colonial powers. We all know what the progressed world did to the Muslim world when it was partitioned after World War I. We all know what happened. All of the subjugation. He actually mentions this. He mentions this in the book here. All of the subjugation that happened under British rule in Palestine. It's all known. Anyone who's honest with themselves and approaches history with an impartial eye will know what the British powers did to establish the Zionist presence in Palestine. We all know that. It's documented historically. And all of the revolutions against the colonial powers that needed to be waged in different Muslim countries, whether it's against Italy, and we talk about Umar al-Mukhtar in Libya, or we're talking about against the French, like in Syria, and other. This is the most recent history that we have of colonial powers. Now, we don't have colonialism as a model anymore in the traditional way, but now we have a new form of this through countries and their foreign policies, right? And it's not like it's any hidden fact. It's the spoken policy of the superpowers of today, right? We will put our money where it serves our national interests. And foreign policy has always been weaponized to subjugate countries that do not have, but now it's done through what? It's done through the World Bank. It's done through interest, right? It's done through business transactions. That's how it's done. So it's a new form of colonialism to subjugate people and pressure countries to follow you. As awful as the situation may be, the situation would not be like it is had the remaining Muslim countries in our time not been subjugated to the superpowers of our time. Someone would have spoken out. But now everyone is too afraid to speak out against the genocide in Gaza, or almost everyone's afraid. Why? Because, again, because a new type of colonialism that's there. We're not talking about justice that's in the world there today now. We're not talking about etiquette in war. We're talking about treachery. We're talking about betrayal. We're talking about, killing everything in sight. That's what we're talking about. So anyway, when it comes to etiquettes in war in Islam, we learn that there are the untouchables, the elderly, the disabled, women and children, and non-combatants as well. We also learn something very profound from the Islamic tradition, and that is no treachery allowed, no matter how much it's in our favor. Right? No treachery allowed. And there's an example during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, with Sayyidina Hudayfa ibn al-Yaman and his father. When they were stopped by the mushrikeen, and the mushrikeen asked them, "Where are you going?" Right? And this was in the Battle of Uhud. This is the Battle of Uhud. This is why they didn't participate in the Battle of Uhud. Where are you going? Right? So they said, "We're going to Medina." So they made Sayyidina Hudayfa take an oath, him and his father, that they're not going to join forces with the Prophet ﷺ. So then when they left, they went to the Prophet. They actually went and met the Prophet, and they said, "We've come to join forces with you." So they told the Prophet ﷺ what happened, and the Prophet ﷺ said, "Insarifa, leave here right now. You're not going to fight with us. نفي لهم بعهدهم ونستعين الله عليهم." We will be loyal to our promises to them, and we will seek Allah's assistance in defeating them. And this is who? Sayyidina Hudayfa ibn al-Yaman. The Prophet declined him joining the battle when the Muslims were at a severe disadvantage, 1-3 ratio, and they needed everybody. But the Prophet ﷺ said, "We're not a people of treachery. You made a promise, you're going to fulfill that." So Adamul Ghadr, it's another etiquette of war in the Islamic tradition. The prohibition of causing corruption in the land. It's a heinous thing. I do not know. Well, actually, I do know. How has the modern mind, with all the progressiveness that we find in every other facet of life, okayed the sight of Israeli soldiers demolishing residential homes and demolishing olive trees that have been around for over 100 years? How does it work? I know how it works. One word, APAC. That's what it's called. So that's the only thing that makes sense. APAC. And it makes these false alliances and allegiances that come about because of politics. They have nothing to do with spreading justice in the world. Tell me the justice in selling properties in Palestine in Teaneck, New Jersey. Tell me where the justice is that in there. Where is the justice in that? Everyone knows the illegal settlements and the continued expansion of Israel over the past few decades. But again, justice is not the name of the game. That's what happens when you have people who are morally bankrupt as leaders of the world. It's the reality. It's not the politics. It has nothing to do with politics. If it was a Muslim doing the same thing, I would say the same exact thing. We're not allowed to do this. We're not allowed to do this. It's immoral and it's illegal, right? You know, if we saw, and it's actually happened in our past, if we saw Muslims burning down churches, is that something that's okay? You know, like, you know, in our tradition, is it okay to, you know, wreak havoc on people in their other faiths? No, that's not how we operate. We don't burn down churches. If that was the case, then there would not be a minority presence throughout the ages, you know, throughout in the Muslim world. That's not how it happens. You know, it would not happen like that. You know, Muslims have coincided with other faiths in many different countries. Like Christians, Muslims and Christians in Palestine. You have Muslims and Jews in Morocco. There's a lot of Jews in Morocco, right? And then you have the same thing in Iraq, same thing in Lebanon, in Syria. You know, so if it was the case that Muslims are somehow these radical bunch, and Muhammad ﷺ teaches them to spread terror across the land, then you would find every Muslim ideologically driven, I'm going to go break crosses and I'm going to burn churches. We don't do that. Are there some Muslims who do crazy things? Yes. And for every example of a Muslim terrorist that you can bring me, I'll bring you 10 examples of a right-wing Christian terrorist in our own country, right? Again, this is not, you know, if you go to the FBI reports, and they read the statistics, what are the biggest examples of terrorism in our country? It's not Islamic terrorism. Islamic terrorism is the only one that makes the headlines. It is right-wing Christian terrorists. Just look it up. Look it up. You know, but again, like the agenda-driven media is all about falsifying things and causing misdirection. Terrorism is not a Muslim problem. Terrorism is not a Muslim problem. Is it a problem? And are some Muslims' hands bloodied with? Yeah, sure, of course. I'm not going to tell you every Muslim is innocent. There's tons of, you know, and you know the biggest terrorists, they're the ones who run our countries, right? Go tell me about those individuals who have people imprisoned, locked away in prison cells and torture chambers for decades on end. We saw one of those terrorists toppled in Syria, and then we saw what was hidden under the earth, right? Is that terrorism or not? Well, just because you're a state and because you have a government that automatically makes you immune to the word terrorism? No, that's not the case, you know. Anyone who's honest and genuine and is looking for the truth will find the truth. But anyone who wants to just buy into false rhetoric, and you know, by the way, again, why am I saying all this? Hopefully, this type of course will put Muslims on a mission. You know, I want to be confident in my identity as a Muslim. Well, you know what? I guarantee you, every time you look for something and you explore the ins and outs of it in our history, you will be able to articulate it with confidence. That's what I need to be able to do. You know, I'm not going to let someone corner me and make me feel ashamed of being a Muslim because some Muslim in this country did that. And there's a hadith that says the Prophet did that, and all of this is, you know, again, how did the Prophet ﷺ teach us to treat prisoners? You will never find, again, like, look, if people, there were people who ferociously hated our Prophet ﷺ during his lifetime. If the Prophet ﷺ had done something that was morally bankrupt, you better believe they would have said it. They have said other things about our Prophet. They said other things about our Prophet. They were looking for things to say about our Prophet ﷺ. Will you ever find a standard that was set by the Prophet or the companions of raping prisoners? No, you won't find that. You'll only find that by people who have no belief in their hearts, right? You know, and we know where this type of stuff happens. It's not just in Israel. There's other places that have been made into makeshift prison camps for terrorists where they did similar acts. You just go read the documents and read the history. You'll find out. All right? What did the Prophet ﷺ tell us to do with prisoners? There's a big story of a prisoner. In the time of the Prophet ﷺ, his name was Osamah ibn Athal. We mentioned this story a lot. You guys remember Osamah? Who can tell me about Osamah? Where was he from? Yes. He was the tribe of Banu Hanifa. And they were in eastern Arabia. And you're right. He had them tied in the masjid. And then? No, different tribe. Banu Hanifa, they were a very powerful tribe. They were in charge of all of the grains. They had a lot of farmlands, right? So what did the Prophet ﷺ do with Thumama? He asked him a single question. He asked him, what do you have to say, O Thumama? So what did he say to the Prophet ﷺ? He said, if you kill me, you're going to kill someone whose blood is precious. My family, my people will avenge me, right? I'm a very valuable person. But if you let me go, you're going to be letting someone go who is very grateful. All right? وَإِن تَقْتُلْنِي تَقْتُلْ ذَا دَمٍ وَإِن تَعْفُ تَعْفُ عَنْ شَاكِرٍ. So then the Prophet ﷺ said nothing. And then the second day came. The Prophet asked him the same question. Thumama said the same thing. Prophet did nothing. ﷺ. Third day, asked him a question. He said the same thing. And then the Prophet ﷺ said two words, let Thumama go. And Thumama was dumbfounded. What is this treatment of prisoners, right? What is this? You know, what is this selflessness? You could have made so much money off of me. You could have made so much money off of me. Yet you simply let me go? So then he left the masjid, washed himself, came back and announced his Islam. And he said to the Prophet ﷺ how he loved him, how he hated him so much before, and now he loved him so much now, and so on and so forth to the end of the hadith. The Quran mentions this behavior, by the way. What does the Quran say in Surah Al-Insan, verse 8? وَتُطْعِمُونَ الطَّعَامَ عَلَى حُبِّهِ مِسْكِينًا وَيَتِيمًا وَأَسِيرًا. And you give the food out of love, right? Out of love. Do you really need to say out of love for the prisoner? Why? And you give the food out of love, ala hubbih, to someone who is miskeen, needy, someone who is an orphan. Okay, that's understood. And someone who is a prisoner, wa asira, right? So again, this is a standard and the etiquette that Islam set for prisoners. In a world where slavery fueled economies, Islam sought to do away with slavery, right? And all the wars of the past, this is something that a lot of people misunderstand about Islam when they think of, well, Islam can't be the truth because Islam promotes slavery. And they don't realize what's the difference between, again, the slavery of the Christian West and the slavery of Islam. Right, the transatlantic slave trade and the whitewashing and forcing people into Christianity. And I think what's that book called again? I think it's called Servants of Allah or Slaves of Allah, Sylvain Diouf or something. It tells you the story of Muslim slaves. Look it up. Sylvain Diouf, I think that was the name. Dioufffe. It speaks about Muslim slaves that were brought to America. And crazy stories. Again, the whitewashing and forcing them to become Christian, changing their names, making them forget their past, denying them access to education. And then you want to tell me that Muslims are terrorists. That's a modern form of terrorism that happened in the beginning of our country. Right? You literally set the standard for compelling people to live their religions and forcing them into subjugation. That's something that Fir'aun himself did. And when you look at Islam tried to do away, it wasn't racially driven. Islam tried to do away with slavery and remove it. And those people who were emancipated through Islam's system of slavery went on to become the greatest scholars in Islam. They were revered from the early generations of the Tabi'een, the likes of, and from the companions too, the likes of Bilal. And again, it wasn't racially driven. It wasn't about color. It was the only route to slavery in the pre-modern time, and for Muslims, was through war. And even with that, you have the examples, like from the life of the Prophet ﷺ, where those who were taken as prisoners in Badr, they were given an offer. Teach some of our illiterate children to read and write, and you will walk free. Islam wants to enslave people? No. Again, the esteemed morals of Islam are so clear and evident when it comes to etiquettes in war. So that's spending on the prisoner. That's honoring the prisoner. That's prohibiting the mutilation of bodies, right? There's a hadith here where the Prophet ﷺ tells us that those who will have the most severe punishment on the day of judgment, among them, or one of them who's listed, is someone who mutilated the bodies of the deceased. So that's what the Islamic tradition set as a standard for etiquette in war. And we spent so much more time than I was expecting to on that one point about etiquette in war. But there's some very nice things in the rest of the book about the charitable institutions and the system of awqaf. And it's in this book, it's page 145. It's called Public Welfare Institutions. And how the system of zakah, there was social systems in place to reform people and to protect them from needing to resort to theft, right? From needing to resort to sinfulness. That's why, for example, even this institution of marriage, the Prophet ﷺ says, if someone of good character and deen comes seeking marriage, then فَزَوِّجُوهُ إِلَّا تَفْعَلُوا تَكُنْ فِتْنَةٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ وَفَسَادٌ كَبِيرٌ. If you do not do that, then what will happen? There will be fitna and great corruption in the land. So there were many social systems, like the marriage institution in Islam, that were put in place to make sure that people do not resort to wrongdoing. They don't resort to... That's what Islamic civilization contributed to the world. The Islamic civilization, there's a verse in the Quran that says, in this regard, I guess since we spoke about marriage institution, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ يُحِبُّونَ أَن تَشِيعَ الْفَاحِشَةُ فِي الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا لَهُمْ عَذَابٌ أَلِيمٌ فِي الدُّنْيَا وَالْآخِرَةِ. The Quran sets a clear red zone. Those who like for the proliferation of indecency will have a painful punishment in this life and the next. That's a red zone. Don't cross it here. That's what Islamic civilization contributed to the world, right? Islamic civilization did not gain its prosperity by capitalizing on people's desires and indulgences, right? Again, this is one of the unfortunate realities of our time. When you compare the morals and morality that drove Islamic civilization to what is driving our civilization today, our civilization today falls so much shorter. In our day and age, civilization is built upon capitalism. What does that mean? Whatever you can to just get more money. It doesn't matter who you step on and what you corrupt in the process. If you're able to get more money, then it doesn't matter what you do. Do whatever you want. You know that people have a weakness and they want desires, give them desires and give them more desires. So it's not, the civilization today is not centered on morality. It's centered on materialism. Materialism is the name of the game. Morality, leave that to yourself in your place of worship. Leave us alone. That's how civilization operates today. But in the Islamic tradition, we had awqaf, public welfare institutions. These awqaf would serve different causes. Now you find a hybrid of this with some. Now, of course, when it comes to taking care of the vulnerable aspects of society today, you find that the West does a great job at providing financial services to those who have disadvantages, who cannot earn, who are disabled. We do need to recognize that. Our Muslim world today, unfortunately, if you're a disabled person or an elderly person, tough luck. Unfortunately, with the system of zakah not really applied the way it should be, if you are a disabled person or an elderly person or someone who cannot provide, then you're going to have a really, really, really difficult life in the world and in our Muslim world today. It's so unfortunate. But historically speaking, there were public welfare trusts, we call them awqaf, endowments, that were set up for different causes. There's a endowment for students of knowledge. There was an endowments for animals, right? The surprise. And there was endowments for animals, for the care of animals, stray cats and stray dogs that needed food and needed water in the streets, in the public streets. There was endowments for the disabled, right? They say the first one to actually set the standard for putting a stipend from the state for those who were disabled was Sayyidina Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. So you see that there was thought given to the things that need to be put in place for the different elements in society. That's what he talks about in chapter 8 of this book. Again, this is something more than sadaqah, by the way. And then endowments is something more than zakah. So we have the system of zakah is one thing. Zakah is paid to certain recipients, certain categories. And we have endowments, that's something that's supposed to last for generations. Like I'll give you an example from Egypt. I studied at Al-Azhar. I'm not from Egypt, but I studied in Egypt, Al-Azhar. And Al-Azhar, in the middle of the last century, before it began to weaken as an institution, was actually considered a state within a state. It was a state within a state. People, what does that mean? It was fully independent. It had so many properties that would bring into it a lot of income. It had so many properties where students coming from abroad would reside. In fact, this is actually in the masjid of Al-Azhar itself, where we would call the wing of those Rawaq al-Atrak, the wing of those coming from Turkey, Rawaq al-Maghariba, Rawaq al-Afariqa, those coming from Africa. They had a special wing in the masjid where they would be, boarding in the masjid. They would live in the masjid. They would come from their countries without anything. And they would have a place to stay, whether they're from Morocco or Turkey or Africa or other parts of the world. And again, it had massive awqaf. It did not need the funding of a state. And that's why in the early part of the last century, the scholars of Al-Azhar were very outspoken when it came to public policy. I'm talking about the early 1900s, very outspoken. And this all changed when the head of Al-Azhar became an appointed position by the state, right? So what happened was, there was this deplorable leader of the past century, a few presidents ago in Egypt, that dismantled these awqaf. The state seized these properties and sold them off. And they took these endowments that were set up from centuries ago. And they made this Islamic institution fully dependent on the government. And by doing that, they stripped it of its freedom of speech now, because it's appointed, it's state-sponsored. So it's very difficult to say anything that goes against the narrative of the state. Again, that's why these endowments were set up. They were set up historically. There was a lot of endowments set up for scholars so that they could remain free thinkers, right? There was endowments set up for, again, the vulnerable aspects of society. So this is a beautiful thing. I really recommend that you read the rest of this book. We're not going to have time to go through more of it, but the remaining sections on the public welfare institutions, the schools and educational institutions, and the hospital and medical institutions, the public and private libraries, and then he speaks a little bit about the geography, the capitals and large cities. All of this, you can read it on your own and reflect on it, inshaAllah ta'ala. If anyone has questions or comments, I can take that now before we conclude. Does anyone? I don't think we would have, I didn't mention the Slido, so I don't think we would have questions in the Slido. But does anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask or comments they'd like to make? Anyone? Yes. Yeah. Yeah, so Jazakallah khair for mentioning that. So she said, was there ever cases of non-Muslims fighting in the Muslim armies? They actually mentioned that in the books of fiqh, yes. And when that did happen, they would be relieved of the jizya. They did not have to pay the jizya. And that's where we take that the jizya was exclusively and directly for the protection of the state because they were excused from needing to fight in the Muslim army. Who else? Anyone else has questions? You know, maybe perhaps what we could do, and I'll consider this for maybe perhaps the fall, we should make a series where we go over these hot topic issues one by one, the ins and outs of each one. You know, because again, like not knowing how to answer these things kind of weakens us when we're like speaking to non-Muslims about Islam. Like I need to be able to articulate the ins and outs of each one of these subjects. When I'm talking about hijab, or I'm talking about Islam and the LGBTQ plus movement and our stance against homosexuality, or the issue of jizya and dhimma, or many of the other hosts of issues. Maybe what we could do is we could make a series on hot topic issues. And I'm hoping that some of what we went over in this course gives you some tools to use as you are speaking for Islam when someone is trying to cast doubt on some of the aspects of the faith. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us tawfiq and understanding, and to use us and to allow us to continue to grow in our faith and make us of agents for change in our time. Allahumma ameen. Allahumma ameen. Akhir da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Jazakumullah khair. And that's the conclusion of this course. As I said, we're going to have our last course for the Prophet's Emotional Intelligence on Tuesday. So please join us then, inshallah, Tuesday after Salat al-Maghrib. And then we're going to break for Eid, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair.